In the previous video, I was trying to figure out a way for our character to exit his ultimate attack pose. As explained before, I want some badass heroic pose. So I first tried the current pose where I want him to put the double-handed sword onto his shoulder. And here is the pose I've reached after some work on the character. Here you can see that I've used a constraint onto the handle of the double-handed sword. This way I can override the relationship with the right hand. By default, the sword is parented to the hand bone, and this way I can freely move the hand without having the sword to follow. There is a custom property that allows me to unparent the double-handed sword. But as you unparent it, it will move in space toward another position. Let me give you an example here with the current pose of the character. As you can see, the trident is parented to the arm, so whatever motion the arm is doing, the trident will inherit this motion. The initial process will be to try to pose the arm and make the trident match the pose. But once I'm done with this rough posing, if I want to tweak the position of the arm or any controller in the arm chain, the trident is moving. Since there is no auto-snapping mechanism on this rig, if I now unparent the trident using the rig functionality, the trident will move away, and I will have to pose it again. So I will reset this, and a very simple way to override the parenting without removing the parenting is to simply use constraint as we did in chapter 4. I've switched to object mode, I will add an empty, then I will add to it a copy transform constraint. And I will source as the target my armature and the controller of the spear. Now the empty has the same location and orientation as the spear. Toggle on and off the constraint, you can see the difference with and without the constraint. So I do want now this pose to be the default pose of the empty, so I will press Ctrl A and apply visual transform. As I do so, we can see the transform channel of our empty changing. And if I disable the constraint, we can see that the empty is no longer moving because we have applied the visual transform. So now I can reverse the constraint, select the spear master controller, add a copy transform constraint and source the empty. Remember not to use base constraint, but bone constraint. With the trident now constrained to the empty, nothing happened on this frame. At least nothing seems to happen, but if I switch to another frame, we can see that the trident is locked to the empty. To deactivate the constraint on the other poses, I will simply add a keyframe on the constraint on the current pose, then go to the previous pose and set its value to 0. By default, Blender will be interpolating on those newly created keyframes, so I will simply select the spear, select the constraint value and switch their interpolation to constant. The benefit is that now the spear is no longer following the arm on this specific frame, but it does still follow the arm on the previous frames. So I can now tweak the position of the arm or tweak the position of the spear using the empty. Beyond the ease of manipulation, there is an additional benefit, and it's substantial. Here in the graph editor, you can see the location of my spear. If I try to move it, we can see its location changing in the value, but it doesn't move in space since it's constrained. Let's say I finished my blocking process and I want to apply this pose to the trident. I will press Ctrl A and apply the visual transform. And then I will just press I to insert a keyframe. I will now hide the constraint and you can see that the trident is still in position. And as I insert a keyframe to update the graph editor, we can see that there is very little change in the location of my trident. If I now repeat the process using the rig functionalities and changing the parenting of the trident is no longer the children of the hand and we can freely move it in space. And this is how I would handle the throw. In our case now, with our trident and parented from the hand, I will proceed the same as before to reposition the trident correctly using the constraint and then apply the visual transform. But now if we watch our graph editor, it messes a bit with the location value of our trident. because now the location curves are no longer based on the hand position but the world position of the trident. So basically you are trying to deal with an asset that has no relation with the body of your character but is still in contact with the body. And this is where it becomes complicated. While if we keep the parenting relationship and override it using a constraint, then our graph editor will still look kind of clean. But if we get rid of the parenting, then there will be a big gap in our graph editor, and that's gonna be a potential source of bugs or problem in our interpolations. I guess it can be a bit confusing at first, but using constraint in your workflow will definitely speed up your posing process. And you will be able to push it even further once you get a little more comfortable with this. Here I can totally change the hierarchy of my rig by adding a child of constraint to the MT, and I will constrain it to the chest controller. I will click set inverse to reset its position, and now I can freely move the chest controller or any controller in its hierarchy, and the MT will follow, and so will the trident. In the hierarchy, the trident is still a child of the end of our character, but using temporary constraint, we have override this, and now I can move the torso controller, for example, and reposition my character. These temporary constraints are awesome to add more functionality to a rig that doesn't have them. And I do prefer to keep my rig simple and then build those constraints on the fly. You could use this method to lock the hand of your character on his hips, for example. Let me give you a little demonstration so that it will be clearer. First, I'm roughly posing my character, but let's say I'm building a nice pose and I want the hand to be on the hips. Let's say I'm happy with the pose. The next step is to add an MT and then constrain the MT with a copy transform to the hand to source its transform channels. To do so, once you've added the constraint, just press Ctrl A and apply the visual transform. From there, you can get rid of the current copy transform constraint. Now I want the MT to follow the hips, so I will add to it a child of constraint and source my hips controller. If as you do so your MT goes away, just click the set inverse button to reset its position. From there, the MT will follow the hips, so now I can select my hand controller and add to it a copy transform and source the MT, and now the hand will follow the MT that is following the hips. So now I can try to create a super badass pose or not, but whatever, I don't need to care about the hand position. It will follow the hip.